A man can own a city and still have nowhere to rest his mind. At 2:13 in the morning, Adrian Bennett stood alone beneath the warm lights of his Chicago mansion, listening to the silence he had spent years paying to create. The house was enormous, built from polished marble, dark walnut, crystal, and glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected thousands of city lights across the room, while an antique clock marked every passing second with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Adrian had everything people associated with power: money, influence, a private staff, a black luxury sedan waiting beyond the gates. Yet sleep had become something he remembered rather than something he experienced. At 43, the white European mafia boss had learned how to control almost every detail of his world. He could command a room without raising his voice. He could make a decision while everyone else was still debating. He could walk through pressure without allowing it to reach his face. Tonight, however, his calm expression concealed a fatigue that no business report could explain. His dark brown hair was swept neatly backward, threaded with approximately 30% natural silver, while his short-boxed beard carried the same subtle traces of gray. His light olive skin showed natural texture beneath the soft interior lighting. He wore a tailored black suit over a black dress shirt opened at the collar, exposing part of the fixed black and gray tattoo covering his neck and upper chest, with the same intricate ink continuing across both hands and fingers. Adrian looked like a man who belonged at the top of the world. He felt like a man who had been standing there alone for too long. Downstairs, Naomi Carter was finishing her work. The Black Maid moved quietly through the kitchen, checking counters, arranging clean cups, and making sure the staff area was ready for the morning. She had learned the rhythm of the mansion without ever becoming part of its noise. At 30, Naomi carried herself with quiet dignity. Her deep brown-black skin had a healthy, natural glow, her oval face framed by high cheekbones, a softly rounded chin, and a graceful V-shaped jawline. Her dark brown almond-shaped eyes were attentive without being intrusive. Her makeup was natural, with subtle eyeliner, warm eyeshadow, carefully shaped brows, and lightly glossy nude lips. Then she heard it, a sharp sound from upstairs. Glass against marble. Naomi stopped. She knew the household rules. Adrian valued privacy, and everyone who worked for him understood that his personal space was not theirs to enter. But something about the sound made her pause. She waited. Nothing. Then she heard footsteps. Naomi quietly climbed the stairs and found Adrian standing alone in the hallway. A glass lay broken several feet away, but he was unharmed. He looked toward her, his expression immediately returning to its familiar calm. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked. "I am fine." Naomi nodded. She did not question him. She did not stare. Instead, she walked downstairs and returned a moment later carrying a small porcelain cup. She placed it on the console table beside him. Steam rose gently from the tea. Adrian looked at it, then at her. "What is that?" "Tea." His eyebrow lifted slightly. "I can see that." Naomi almost smiled. "Then we understand each other." She turned to leave. "Naomi." She stopped. "Why did you bring this?" She looked at him for a quiet second. "Because you looked tired." No one had said that to him in a long time. Not his advisors. Not his employees. Not the people who depended on his decisions. They saw the mafia boss. They saw the power, the money, the control. Naomi had seen the man standing underneath it. Adrian looked down at the rising steam. For reasons he could not explain, he did not tell her to leave. He simply stood there, listening to the clock, watching the tea grow cooler, and wondering when exactly his life had become so full that there was no room left for peace. The next evening, Adrian came home at exactly 8:16, yet he could not remember a single detail from the drive back. The city had moved around him in a blur of headlights, traffic signals, and rain-darkened streets, while his mind remained fixed on one sentence: "Because you looked tired." He had heard concern before. It usually came wrapped in careful language, professional courtesy, or an expectation of something in return. Naomi had offered none of that. She had simply noticed him. The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Adrian entered the mansion through the main doors, handed his coat to a waiting employee, and walked directly toward the dining room. A table had been prepared for one. Crystal glassware, polished silver, a warm plate beneath a covered dish. Everything was precise. Everything was expensive. Everything looked untouched by human emotion. Adrian sat down, lifted the cover, and stared at the meal for several seconds. He took 2 bites. Then he stopped. Across the room, Naomi entered carrying a folded linen cloth. She noticed the untouched plate, but said nothing. She continued working until Adrian finally looked up. "Was there something wrong with dinner?" he asked. Naomi turned. "No, sir. You looked at the plate. I noticed you had barely eaten." Adrian leaned back. "That sounds like the same thing." "Maybe it is." Her answer was calm. He studied her for a moment. Most people became careful when Adrian looked at them that way. Naomi simply waited. "You brought tea last night," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "I already told you." "Because I looked tired." "Yes." Adrian glanced toward the empty chair across from him. "Do you do that for everyone?" Naomi considered the question. "If someone looks tired, I try to make their evening a little easier. Even if they do not ask. Especially then." Something about that answer stayed with him. Adrian had spent years surrounded by people who waited for instructions. Naomi seemed to understand that kindness did not always require permission. She placed the folded cloth on the sideboard and began to leave. "Naomi." She stopped again. "Would you sit for a minute?" She looked surprised, but she did not make a fuss about it. She pulled out a chair several feet away and sat down. Adrian looked at his plate. "I do not know what I am supposed to say." "You do not have to say anything." So they sat in silence. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The dining room clock moved steadily forward. Adrian picked up his fork again. This time, he ate slowly. Naomi did not. "Watch him." She looked toward the windows instead, giving him the dignity of not being observed while he accepted something as simple as a meal. When he finished, Adrian placed the fork beside the plate. "That was better," he said. Naomi smiled faintly. "Good." She stood. "Good night, Mr. Bennett." He watched her walk toward the kitchen. "Good night." Later, Adrian found himself in the library with the lights low and the city beyond the windows. He should have been reviewing documents. Instead, he kept thinking about the empty chair across from him. It was strange how a person could sit several feet away and somehow make a room feel less empty. The next morning, Adrian entered the kitchen before anyone expected him. Naomi was preparing coffee for the staff. She looked over her shoulder. "Good morning." "Good morning." Adrian paused beside the counter. "Do you always make tea at night?" "Usually." "For yourself?" "Sometimes." He looked at the kettle. "Make one for me." Naomi nodded. "Of course." She prepared the cup and placed it in front of him. Adrian wrapped both hands around it, feeling the warmth move through his fingers. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he asked the question that had been waiting behind everything else. "How did you learn to notice people like that?" Naomi looked at him carefully. "Because I know what it feels like when nobody notices you." Adrian lowered his eyes to the tea. That answer was simple. Too simple. And somehow, it made him want to know what she meant. Adrian did not ask the question again that morning. He carried it with him instead. "How did you learn to notice people like that?" By noon, the words had followed him through 3 meetings, 2 phone calls, and a quiet lunch he barely touched. He had spent years believing that people revealed themselves through what they wanted. Naomi seemed to reveal herself through what she noticed. That difference unsettled him. Later that afternoon, Adrian found her in the library, carefully arranging a stack of books that had been left on a side table. Sunlight entered through the tall windows and stretched across the polished floor. "You never answered me," he said. Naomi looked up. "About what?" "This morning." She remembered. "You asked how I learned to notice people." "Yes." She placed the final book on the shelf. "Life taught me." Adrian stood near the doorway, hands resting loosely at his sides. His dark brown hair was swept backward, natural silver catching the afternoon light, and his short boxed beard showed the same subtle silver. He wore his tailored black suit and open black shirt, exposing part of the fixed black and gray tattoo across his upper chest and neck. His calm expression remained composed, but his eyes were more curious than commanding. "That sounds vague." "It is." She smiled faintly. "Some lessons are." Adrian looked toward the window. "I do not like vague answers." "I know." "How?" "You like things you can measure." He looked back at her. "And you think people cannot be measured?" "Not in the ways that matter." The room became quiet. Adrian had heard people disagree with him before. Usually they became nervous halfway through their sentences. Naomi simply stood there, respectful and steady. He found himself asking another question. "What happened to you?" Naomi was silent for a moment. "Nothing you need to fix." Adrian's expression changed slightly. I did not say I wanted to fix it. You usually do. He almost smiled. She was right. If something was broken, Adrian repaired it. If something was uncertain, he investigated it. If something was painful, he buried it beneath responsibility. But Naomi seemed to understand that some things were not problems waiting for a solution. They were experiences waiting to be understood. My family struggled when I was younger, she said eventually. There were times when people helped us without asking questions. A neighbor brought groceries. A teacher kept extra school supplies for me. Someone once paid a utility bill and never told us who did it. Adrian listened carefully. You never found out? No, that bothered you? No. It taught me something. What? Naomi looked directly at him. Kindness does not become less valuable because nobody sees it. Adrian lowered his gaze. The sentence seemed to settle somewhere deeper than he expected. That evening, he returned to his study and opened an old drawer. Inside was a photograph he had not looked at in years. Two brothers stood beside a lake, younger and carefree, before money had become responsibility and responsibility had become distance. Michael was smiling. Adrian stared at the photograph until the room around him seemed to disappear. He remembered something he had not allowed himself to remember in a long time. Michael had always noticed people. He remembered the smallest details. He remembered birthdays, favorite foods, old stories, names of strangers they had met only once. Adrian had once teased him for it. Now the memory felt almost sacred. The next morning, Adrian carried the photograph downstairs. Naomi was preparing tea when he entered. She looked at the picture in his hand, then at him. Your brother? She asked. Adrian nodded. His name was Michael. Naomi did not ask what had happened to him. She simply looked at the photograph and said, He looks happy. Adrian studied his brother's face. He was. His voice became quieter. I think I forgot that. Naomi placed a fresh cup of tea on the counter. Then maybe remembering is a good place to start. Adrian looked at her. For years, he had thought healing meant forgetting what hurt. That morning, for the first time, he wondered if healing could mean remembering what was worth keeping. Adrian began noticing Naomi everywhere after that morning, not because she sought his attention, but because she never did. She moved through the mansion with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that dignity did not depend on being seen. On Monday afternoon, Adrian watched from the library doorway as she helped one of the older household employees organize a stack of appointment papers. On Tuesday, he noticed her leave a small paper bag near the staff entrance for a groundskeeper who had mentioned that his shift would run late. On Wednesday, she stayed several minutes after her work was finished to make sure a new employee understood the household schedule. None of it appeared in a report. None of it reached Adrian's desk. Yet somehow, he began seeing the pattern. Naomi gave without announcing it. She helped without keeping score. And she never once behaved as though kindness made her more important than anyone else. One rainy Thursday evening, Adrian found her in the kitchen preparing a simple meal for the night staff. Warm light reflected across the polished counters, and the smell of fresh bread filled the room. He stopped near the doorway. You are still working. Naomi glanced over. So are you. Adrian looked down at his phone. Several unread messages waited on the screen. Fair point. She smiled and returned to the counter. Adrian watched her place food into several containers. You do that often? When people work late, do they pay you extra? Naomi looked at him. No, then why? She closed one container carefully. Because they are hungry. Adrian almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. You make everything sound obvious. Sometimes it is. He walked closer, keeping a respectful distance. What if nobody notices? Naomi looked at him. They do not need to. That answer stayed with him. Adrian had spent his entire life surrounded by people who noticed everything he did. Every decision was analyzed. Every purchase was discussed. Every gesture was measured for meaning. Naomi seemed to live by an entirely different rule. She could do something kind and walk away without waiting for applause. Where did you learn that? He asked. Naomi was quiet for a moment. When I was younger, my family struggled. She placed another container on the counter. There were people who helped us without asking for recognition. A neighbor brought groceries. A teacher kept extra school supplies for me. Someone once helped with a utility bill. Adrian listened. You never found out who paid it? No. Did that bother you? Naomi shook her head. It taught me something. Adrian waited. Kindness does not become less valuable just because nobody knows who gave it. The kitchen seemed quieter after that. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Adrian looked at the containers lined neatly across the counter and suddenly thought about Michael. His brother had been like that. Michael remembered birthdays. He remembered names. He noticed when someone was having a difficult day and somehow found a way to make it lighter. Adrian had once called it sentimental. Now the memory felt different. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an old photograph. Michael stood beside him in the picture, younger and smiling beside a lake. Naomi looked at it, but did not touch it. "Your brother?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "Michael." His voice lowered. He was good at noticing people too. Naomi looked at the photograph again. "Then maybe you learn more from him than you think." Adrian stared at his brother's face. For years, he had believed that remembering Michael meant reopening a wound he had worked hard to close. But standing there in the warm kitchen, surrounded by simple food prepared for people who needed it, he wondered whether he had remembered the wrong part. Maybe Michael was not only the person Adrian had lost. Maybe he was also the person who had shown Adrian who he could have been. Adrian slipped the photograph back into his pocket. "Thank you," he said. Naomi gave a small nod. "For what?" Adrian looked toward the rain-covered window. "For making me notice what I stopped noticing." Neither of them spoke after that. The kitchen remained warm. The rain continued outside. And somewhere inside Adrian, a door he had kept closed for years had finally begun to move. The old photograph was still on Adrian's desk when the next challenge arrived. By 8 the following morning, 3 messages had appeared on his phone, all carrying the same concern. People inside his organization were beginning to question why he was stepping away from responsibilities he had always handled himself. Adrian read each message in silence, his expression calm, his brown eyes steady beneath thick brows. The city beyond his office windows was bright with morning traffic, but the room felt colder than usual. For years, Adrian had built his reputation on control. Every decision passed through him. Every uncertainty was examined. Every responsibility was carried personally, as if putting it down for even a moment might cause everything around him to collapse. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether the weight he carried was actually protecting anyone. Naomi entered the study with a fresh cup of coffee. She placed it beside him and noticed the papers spread across the desk. "Something wrong?" she asked. Adrian looked up. "People are questioning my decisions." Naomi glanced at the documents, then back at him. "Are you questioning them?" The question landed quietly. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Some of them. Then maybe they should be questioned." He almost smiled. "You make difficult things sound simple. Only when they are." She turned to leave, but Adrian stopped her. "Naomi." She looked back. "How do you know when helping someone becomes controlling them?" She thought for a moment. "When you stop asking what they need and start deciding what they should need." Adrian looked down at the photograph beside his desk. Michael had always hated being told what to do. He had once told Adrian that people needed room to make their own choices, even when those choices were different from his. Adrian had forgotten that. Or perhaps he had remembered it and refused to listen. That afternoon, Adrian made a decision that surprised even him. He began transferring several responsibilities to people he trusted. Not because he was abandoning his position, but because he finally understood that leadership did not mean carrying every burden alone. It meant knowing when to trust someone else with part of the weight. By evening, the tension in the mansion had softened. Adrian left his study before dinner, something that would have been unusual only a few weeks earlier. He walked through the kitchen and found Naomi preparing a simple meal for the staff. "You are early," she said. "I finished work." Naomi looked at the clock. "That is new." Adrian smiled faintly. "I am learning." She handed him a plate. "Then start with dinner." He looked at it. "You are giving me instructions now." "Only the important ones." Adrian sat at the table with the staff that evening. At first, everyone seemed uncertain. Conversations were quiet. People watched him carefully, unsure whether this was another test. Adrian simply ate and listened. Gradually, the room changed. Someone mentioned a family birthday. Another employee told a funny story about a delivery driver who had taken the wrong street. Laughter followed. Adrian listened. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed too. It was not loud, but it was genuine. Naomi noticed from across the table and said nothing. She understood that some moments became smaller when they were explained. Later that night, Adrian returned to his study and looked at the photograph of Michael. He realized something important. He had spent years believing that strength meant never needing anyone. But Michael had never admired that version of him. He had admired the brother who listened Who stayed? Who noticed? Adrian picked up the photograph and carried it downstairs. Naomi was in the kitchen preparing tea for the night staff. He placed the photograph on the counter between them. I think I finally understand him, Adrian said. Naomi looked at the picture. Maybe you are finally ready to. Adrian nodded. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. Inside, the mansion felt warmer than it had in years. And for the first time, Adrian was not trying to control the silence. He was simply allowing it to exist. The morning after dinner with the staff, Adrian woke before sunrise and remained still for several minutes, listening to the quiet house. A few months earlier, silence had felt like pressure. Now it felt different. Not empty, not threatening, simply quiet. He got dressed and walked downstairs before the household was fully awake. In the kitchen, Naomi was already preparing coffee and tea. She looked up when he entered. You are early, she said. Adrian glanced at the clock. I wanted to try something. Naomi handed him a cup of coffee. What? A normal morning. She smiled. That sounds difficult for you. Adrian almost laughed. You are probably right. He stood near the counter, holding the warm cup between his hands. His dark brown hair was swept neatly backward, natural silver visible through the strands, and his short boxed beard carried the same subtle silver. He wore his tailored black suit with an open black shirt, revealing part of the fixed black and gray tattoo across his upper chest and neck. His calm expression remained composed, but there was less tension around. His eyes. I slept 6 hours, he said. Naomi looked genuinely pleased. That is progress. I usually sleep 4. Then 6 is progress. Adrian nodded. I am beginning to understand why you say simple things. Naomi smiled. Simple does not mean easy. He carried that sentence with him throughout the day. For the first time, Adrian left several decisions with people he trusted instead of reviewing every detail himself. He answered fewer calls. He walked away from his desk for lunch. He even spent 20 minutes outside near the lake without bringing his phone. None of these choices changed the world, yet they changed the way he experienced it. By late afternoon, Adrian returned to the library and found Naomi organizing a shelf near the window. Can I ask you something? He said. You usually do. He smiled. What happens when someone has spent so long protecting themselves that they no longer know how to relax? Naomi placed a book on the shelf. They start by learning that not everything needs protection. Adrian looked toward the photograph of Michael resting on his desk. I thought protecting everything meant I was responsible. Responsibility is good, Naomi said. But responsibility without trust becomes exhaustion. Adrian remained quiet. The words were difficult because they were true. He had spent years believing that if he watched everything closely enough, nothing important could slip away. But Michael had slipped away anyway. No amount of control had changed that. Perhaps that was the lesson Adrian had refused to learn. That evening, he made another decision. He asked the household staff to join him for dinner again. This time, there was no hesitation. People entered the dining room naturally, taking their places and talking among themselves. Adrian sat at the table instead of at the head. Naomi noticed, but said nothing. The conversation grew warmer as the meal continued. Someone mentioned a child's upcoming school event. Another employee talked about a weekend trip to visit family. Adrian listened and asked questions. He remembered names. He remembered details. For once, he was not thinking about what needed to happen next. He was simply there. After dinner, everyone slowly left the room. Naomi remained near the doorway. Adrian looked around the table and then at her. It feels different. What does? The house. Naomi nodded. Because people are using it now. Adrian smiled. She was right. The mansion had never needed more furniture, more money, or more security. It had needed people to feel welcome inside it. Later that night, Adrian returned to the lake and sat alone on the familiar bench. He placed Michael's photograph beside him. The water reflected the moonlight in soft, broken lines. Adrian looked at the photograph and finally allowed himself to smile. He did not feel finished. He did not feel completely healed. But he no longer felt trapped inside the past. For the first time, he understood that peace was not a place where nothing could hurt him. It was the freedom to live even when life remained imperfect. The first real test of Adrian's new peace arrived on a gray Monday morning. By 9 o'clock, several messages were waiting on his desk, all carrying the same concern. People within his organization had noticed that he was stepping away from responsibilities he once handled personally, and some believed the change meant he was losing control. Adrian read the messages without reacting. His dark brown hair was swept neatly backward, natural silver visible through the strands, and his short boxed beard carried the same subtle silver. He wore his tailored black suit and open black shirt, revealing part of the fixed black and gray tattoo across his upper chest and neck. His brown eyes remained steady, but something inside him was unsettled. Months earlier, this would have been enough to send him into another cycle of endless calls, meetings, and decisions. He would have taken every responsibility back before anyone else could touch it. This time, he simply sat there. Then his phone rang. An old advisor was on the other end, questioning the changes and warning that people were beginning to see Adrian as less decisive. Adrian listened without interrupting. When the call ended, he remained at his desk. The old instinct returned quietly. Take control. Fix everything. Do not let anyone else decide. He stood and walked toward the library, but halfway down the hall he stopped. Through the open kitchen doorway, he saw Naomi preparing tea. She noticed him. Everything all right? She asked. Adrian looked at her for a moment. People think I am changing too much. Naomi placed a cup on the counter. Are you? I do not know. She waited. Adrian continued. I spent my whole life believing that if I did not control something, I would lose it. Naomi looked at him carefully. And did controlling everything keep you from losing things? Adrian had no answer. The mansion seemed unusually quiet. He walked into the kitchen and sat at the small table near the window. No, he finally said. Naomi sat across from him, leaving a respectful distance between them. Then maybe control was never the thing protecting you. Adrian looked down at his hands, the fixed black and gray tattoos covering his fingers and the backs of his hands. What was? Trust, Naomi said. But trust is harder. He gave a faint smile. Much harder. Later that day, Adrian returned to his office and made a decision. He would not abandon his responsibilities. He would simply stop carrying every responsibility alone. He delegated several matters to people he trusted, allowed decisions to move forward without his personal approval, and resisted the urge to check every detail. It felt uncomfortable. More than once, his hand reached toward the phone before he stopped himself. The old Adrian was still there. He had not disappeared. He was simply learning that he did not have to obey every instinct he had developed over the years. That evening, Adrian walked through the garden toward the lake. Naomi was already there, standing near the familiar bench. You look thoughtful, she said. I am. He sat down. I almost went back to the way I used to be today. Naomi nodded. But you did not. How do you know? You were sitting here. Adrian smiled. The answer was so simple that it almost made him laugh. They watched the water for several minutes. Then Adrian said, I am afraid that if I stop controlling everything, I might lose people. Naomi looked toward the lake. People who stay only because you control them are not really staying. Adrian absorbed the words slowly. He had spent years surrounding himself with loyalty without asking whether people felt free to disagree with him. Perhaps that was not loyalty. Perhaps it was only obedience. The distinction was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Adrian looked across the water. Michael used to say something similar. Naomi turned toward him. What did he say? Adrian smiled faintly. He said people are not possessions. The evening breeze moved through the trees. Adrian leaned back against the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. He could still feel the pressure waiting for him inside the house. The messages would still be there tomorrow. The decisions would still need to be made. Nothing outside him had magically changed, but something inside him had. For once, he did not need to solve everything before allowing himself to breathe. He simply sat beside the lake, listening to the quiet, and let the world continue without him for a little while. The next morning, Adrian found the old photograph exactly where he had left it. Michael stood beside him in the picture, smiling beside the lake, unaware that years later his brother would spend so much time trying to outrun the memory of that peaceful afternoon. Adrian picked up the photograph and held it beneath the soft morning light. For years, he had kept it hidden in a drawer because looking at it made him remember everything he had lost. Now, he wondered if hiding it had only made the loss heavier. He carried the photograph downstairs and found Naomi in the kitchen. She was preparing tea for the evening staff, moving quietly between the counter and the stove. She looked up when Adrian entered. You brought it back, she said. Adrian glanced at the photograph. I think I am tired of hiding it. Naomi nodded. That sounds like a good reason to stop. He placed the photograph on the counter. I spoke with someone who knew Michael yesterday. Naomi waited. He told me stories I had forgotten. Adrian looked down. Michael used to help people without telling anyone. He would remember birthdays, bring groceries to neighbors, and keep extra money for people who needed a little help. I used to think he was too soft. Naomi poured tea into 2 cups. Maybe he was strong in a different way. Adrian looked at her. That is what I am beginning to understand. They stood quietly in the warm kitchen. Steam rose between them, and morning light touched the polished counters. Adrian looked at the photograph again. I spent years thinking I had to become harder after losing him. Naomi placed a cup in front of him. Maybe you were allowed to become wiser instead. The sentence stayed with him throughout the day. By afternoon, Adrian returned to his study and placed Michael's photograph beside the lamp instead of inside the drawer. It was a small decision, but it felt larger than it should have. The room had not changed. The desk remained dark and polished. The city still stretched beyond the windows. His phone still carried messages demanding his attention. Yet the photograph changed the meaning of the room. It reminded him that the past did not have to remain a locked door. Later that evening, Adrian walked through the garden and found Naomi near the lake. She was standing beside the familiar bench, looking across the water. He joined her without saying anything. After a moment, Naomi noticed the photograph in his hand. You brought him outside. Adrian nodded. I thought he might like the view. She smiled. Then you should let him stay. Adrian placed the photograph carefully on the bench. The evening light reflected across the lake, turning the surface gold. Do you think people can really change? He asked. Naomi looked at him. People can choose differently. Adrian considered that distinction. Change sounded like something that happened to a person. Choice sounded like something a person made. He liked the second idea better. I almost went back to the old way yesterday, he admitted. I know. He looked surprised. How? You came here instead. Adrian smiled. You noticed too much. Someone has to. He laughed softly. It was the kind of laugh that no longer felt unfamiliar. They sat on the bench with a respectful space between them, watching the water as the last sunlight faded. Adrian did not check his phone. He did not think about the next meeting. He did not calculate what might go wrong tomorrow. He simply remained there. After several quiet minutes, he looked at the photograph and then at the lake. I spent years trying to protect myself from change, he said. But everything changed anyway. Naomi nodded. That is life. Adrian breathed slowly. Then maybe peace is not stopping change. Maybe peace is knowing you can change with it. Adrian looked at her and understood something he had been missing since the beginning. Naomi had never promised to make his life easier. She had never claimed she could erase his memories or solve his problems. She had simply shown him that he could face them without becoming a stranger to himself. That night, Adrian returned to the mansion and left Michael's photograph on the desk where he could see it. He did not close the drawer. He did not turn away. He left it in the light. And for the first time, remembering did not feel like losing someone all over again. It felt like finally letting someone remain. 3 months later, the mansion no longer sounded the way it used to. The clock still marked each hour. The city still moved beyond the tall windows. Adrian still carried the responsibilities that came with his position, and people still waited for his decisions. But something had changed in the spaces between those things. The silence no longer felt like an accusation. One spring morning, Adrian woke before sunrise and looked across the room at the photograph of Michael resting on his desk. He did not reach for it immediately. He simply looked at it and smiled. Then he dressed, buttoned his tailored black suit, opened the collar of his black shirt, and walked downstairs. His dark brown hair was swept backward, threaded with natural silver, and his short boxed beard carried the same subtle gray. The fixed black and gray tattoos remained visible across his neck, upper chest, hands, and fingers. He still looked like the powerful mafia boss everyone expected to see. But the man carrying that power had changed. In the kitchen, Naomi was preparing tea. She looked up and smiled. You are early. Adrian glanced at the clock. I know. Did you sleep? 7 hours. Naomi raised her eyebrows. 7. Apparently, I am becoming predictable. She laughed softly. Adrian took a cup and leaned against the counter. I used to think peace meant having nothing to worry about. Naomi stirred her tea. And now? He looked through the window toward the garden. Now I think it means knowing what deserves my attention. Naomi nodded. Neither of them needed to say more. Later that morning, Adrian walked into his office and found several messages waiting. A decision needed his approval. Another problem required his attention. A meeting had been moved to the afternoon. The old instinct would have taken over immediately. Instead, Adrian reviewed what truly needed him and trusted others with the rest. He closed the office door at noon and went outside. The garden was bright with spring sunlight. Birds moved through the trees, and the lake beyond the lawn reflected the pale blue sky. Naomi was walking toward the bench with 2 cups of tea. "You knew I would be here?" Adrian asked. "You have been coming here every morning." He smiled. "I suppose I have." They sat beside the lake, leaving the same respectful space between them that had existed from the beginning. Adrian placed Michael's photograph on the bench. The picture no longer felt like an object from a painful past. It felt like a reminder of someone who had taught him, even in memory, how to notice people. "I used to think I had everything," Adrian said quietly. "You did." He looked at her. "Except peace." Naomi smiled. "Maybe peace was never something you could own." Adrian looked across the water. The words were familiar now, but they no longer sounded like advice. They sounded like truth. He had spent years collecting things that could be measured. Money, influence, property, authority. Yet the things that finally changed him could not be measured at all. A cup of tea, a quiet conversation, a photograph left in the light, a meal shared with people he had once barely noticed, a choice to trust instead of control, a decision to remember instead of hide. Adrian turned toward Naomi. "You know, I never thank you properly." She looked at him. "You did. Not. Enough. Then sit here." He smiled. "That is your answer?" For today, they watched the lake together as sunlight moved slowly across the water. Nothing dramatic happened. No crisis arrived. No one demanded anything from Adrian. The world simply continued, and for once, he allowed himself to continue with it. He was still powerful. He was still responsible. He was still carrying parts of his past that would never completely disappear. But he no longer mistook strength for isolation. He no longer believed control was the same as safety, and he no longer measured his life by everything he could possess. When the morning grew warmer, Adrian picked up the photograph and held it carefully. Michael's smile looked almost alive in the sunlight. Adrian smiled back. Then he placed the photograph beside him and reached for his tea. The mansion stood behind them, magnificent and quiet, but it no longer felt empty. And that morning, beside the woman who had never tried to change him, Adrian finally understood the thing he had spent years searching for. Peace was not something someone could give him. It was something he had finally learned to choose.